Oh, see, now I don't know how to press F11. Okay. Hey, everyone. I'm Marla Hertz. I am the chair of the planning committee for the 2025 Southeast Data Librarian Symposium, also known as SEDLS to our fans. Really happy to have you here today. Welcome to SEDLS 2025. We are, I see people have found the links to the sessions. If you know of anybody who's having trouble finding the links, you can feel free to share with them the shared notes document. Hopefully someone can pop that into chat for us here. And just pulling the chat open so I can see it as well. I wanted to just give a warm welcome to everyone that's here today, and whether you've been participating in SEDLS since it began, or if this is your first time, we're so happy to have you here. This year we were able to offer the conference completely free of charge because we've accumulated some funds over the years, and we really wanted to make sure that this conference was open to everyone. We really pride ourselves in being a conference that pertains to beginners and is beginner friendly, but also speaks to some of us who have been in the field for longer. This is our 7th SEDLS event, and so I'm really happy to get us going. And I see a lot of you are putting your location in the chat. It's so fun to see where everyone is coming from. All right. I want to acknowledge all the other fabulous folks who have been planning this year's event. There's a lot that goes on to make this conference happen. We pretty much start planning right after the conference ends. We give ourselves a little break, but really at the beginning of the year, we get going. So I want everyone to just give a virtual round of applause for all of our members to keep this one of these favorite conferences of mine going. There were 10 of us this year from all across the Southeast and beyond. And a special thank you to our sponsors. First, a big thanks to RDAP, the Research Data Access and Preservation Association. They have been our fiscal sponsor and helping us handle the account side of things. Very grateful for that. We're just a small unit, and so we really appreciate their support. And a big thanks to Western Kentucky University, WKU, libraries, particularly to Ashley Orheck Rossi, who is shown here today as our conference host. She is providing the Zoom platform for us today. So all of our meeting links, poster breakout rooms, everything is being hosted by WKU libraries. I wanted to talk a little bit about the format and logistics, especially for those of you who may be new to SEDLS or just want a reminder. These are all of the event types that we're going to have across the next 3 days. We've got short talk sessions, we've got a couple of poster sessions, we have our keynote address later today, workshops, and then we're capping off with a Birds of a Feather social event on Friday afternoon. So our short talks are going to take place so we have a Zoom session for each day, and then separate Zoom sessions for the workshops. So all the short talks, poster sessions, keynote, and social events will be in that day's dedicated Zoom session. For attendees during the short talks, when you come into the Zoom room, you can use the chat for general questions and discussions. Add everything in there. Feel free to chat there. You can also raise your hand if you have questions during the Q&A. We're going to be recording short talks and the keynote and this morning's workshop, but the social event and poster sessions and other workshops will not be recorded. For presenters, we want to make sure that we stay clear to time. So the moderators for each session will be giving you 1 minute verbal and in chat prompts to let you know when you're nearing the end of time. And just before you begin screen sharing, just wait for the go-ahead from the moderator to begin doing that. Workshops this year will be held at 2 o'clock Eastern time on today and tomorrow. And these workshops are going to be, again, in their separate Zoom sessions. If you signed up for those workshops, you'll get a separate email about that. If you can't seem to find that, just reach out to one of the organizers and we'll help get you set up. Poster sessions are going to be at 11:15 Eastern time tomorrow and Friday. Tomorrow's sessions are all posters that were invited from the ICPSR's summer program. And then Friday's session include both juried posters that came from the general submission pool, and also 3 posters from the NNLM's National Center for Data Services summer data internship program. Anyway, they're from NCDS is what I'm trying to get out. For each of those sessions, we'll open up breakout rooms for each poster, and you'll be able to hop at will between the different sessions and the main Zoom room. A reminder for presenters, at least one of your presentation parties should remain in the breakout room during the entire session. And then the main Zoom room itself is going to have a member of the SEDLS committee there to answer any questions that you might have. And that room can also be just for general conversation. In terms of presentation materials, those are going to be archived again this year in OSF. Most of the posters are already in there, so if you want to take a look at them in prep for the poster sessions to plan out which ones you want to attend, those are there. Slides from the presentations will be deposited in OSF after the conference, and recordings will be available in YouTube after that. I encourage you to take a look at the SEDLS website to look for all the times for sessions. And also the communal notes doc is helpful in that regard as well. So our keynote this year, I'm very happy to announce, is Dr. Linda Kellum. She is going to be speaking today after this session. And she's one of the founding organizers of the Data Rescue Project and the Snyder Grenadier Director of the Research Data and Digital Scholarship at the University of Pennsylvania Library. So we're so excited to hear from her about data rescue, a very timely topic. So be sure to key into that later today. And then for the Birds of a Feather poll, we're going to have a poll. So I'll show you that in a second. But last year we did this Birds of a Feather roundtable discussions, and it went really well. So we're going to do that again this year. It'll be our last session of the conference, 2 o'clock on Friday. So we'll be setting up these roundtables in each breakout room with specific topics based on your interests. So in order to get ideas from you, we're going to use Padlet. So you can either submit a topic or upvote a topic that you like. That's open now, and it'll be open until Friday for you to vote. So there's a QR code here, but we also are going to put the link into the chat. And it's also here on this next slide. So if you're not familiar with Padlet, this is what it looks like. Basically, you can upvote topics you like that are already there. And then you can also add new ideas with this big plus button. On mobile, it looks slightly different. The plus button is at the bottom, but the little upvotes are the same. And so here we've added another one on advocating for data services. So I encourage you to add to this and vote on topics that you like, and we'll pick maybe the top 6 or so in order to have a discussion during that Birds of a Feather session. Okay, here's a whole lot of links to help you get oriented to the conference. So we have the program link again here. All the Zoom links are going to be located at the top of the communal links document. Slides and posters are going to be available on OSF. Like I said, posters are there now. Slides will be there after the conference. And we also have a code of conduct. We take our culture very seriously here, and we want to promote, good behavior. So if you're ever, witnessing a violation, you can report that violation, and we'll be monitoring this form during the conference. You can also, if you have questions, email out to the Data Librarian, Southeast Data Librarian Gmail account. We'll be monitoring that as well. And then for attendees, there is an attendee certificate if you need to show that to someone. That's available. We'll also have a presenter certificate for our presenters that we'll share with them after the conference. And if you're posting about SEDLS on social media, we encourage you to use our hashtag. And that's the end of my spiel. I'm really happy to have you all here. We're going to start today with some workshops in this first session, then take a break. We'll have the keynote address, another break, and then come back for some short talks. So, and then another workshop to cap off the day. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to our moderator, Nikki, for this first session.
Morning, everybody. I am happy to introduce our first workshop of the day. So Ctrl+S, Library Decision Makers, Sustaining and Shaping RDS Futures. So I am going to let the presenters introduce themselves and their topic. So take it away.
Thank you. Next slide, Yitzy. So I'm Ellie Dworak, and I'm the Research Data Librarian at Boise State University. And I'm here with colleagues from MIT who will introduce themselves when we get to their half of the session, and with Michelle Armstrong, the Library Associate Dean, and the head of the library's Scholarly Communications and Data Management Unit. And also with us is Yitzy Paul. He's driving the slides today. He's the head of the library's Emerging Technologies and Experiential Learning Unit, which we colloquially call the Maker Lab. So along with Michelle and myself, Yitzy is a member of the library's research data management group, and we draft data management and sharing plans for funded research proposals. The group's been working with researchers to develop data management plans since 2016, and we've drafted 127 plans in that time. So currently I'm working with the Division of Research at Boise State to pilot a research data management add-on service for funded projects. And I've been leading the development of research data policy at Boise State, which is currently being reviewed by stakeholder groups. So in addition to data management, our unit is responsible for the institutional repository and has recently stood up a research information management system, or RIMS, using Elsevier's Pure platform. So the public-facing portion of the RIMS, which we call Experts Portal, presents researcher profiles with information about research outputs and collaboration networks. And then we've also been using the back end of the RIMS in conjunction with SciVal and Scopus to generate reports related to research output for other units on campus. Next slide. So today we're going to build a data advocacy toolkit together, which has several components, as you can see on this slide. I won't read them to you, though. Next.
All right, so today we're going to be doing some hands-on activities. So you're going to be asked to select a project or service or resource to use for this workshop this morning. We do know that what you're working on at your institution is probably going to vary. So just please be sure to select whatever makes sense for you. However, in case you are just starting out or there's not something particular that you want to use for these exercises, we will also give you some examples to select from. So just know that we've kind of got some options for you. So whatever it is that you end up selecting, we recommend that you start with a value statement, which is mostly like internal articulations to help you understand the value of your service or the resources you may have. You have to convince yourself first that you are providing value for the stakeholders, the institutions. So once you've started to articulate those values, then you can develop an elevator pitch, which is where you begin to articulate it. You begin to put it into words that you can then share with your stakeholders. And then depending on your goal, there may be more than one audience that you want to create an elevator pitch for. You may find differences between a higher level administrator versus that researcher, that PI that you're engaged with. So keep that in mind. And then along the way, consider the evidence that will help you demonstrate the value of your services. Next slide. So here's an example of an elevator pitch where we have the value statement. Research data management services for funded projects will allow PIs to spend more time on their actual research. And then you have the elevator pitch piece of it where you start to explain this value that you have that you're presenting to people so that and I'm just going to quickly go through it. We know that managing research data, it's essential, but it often pulls the PI away from the actual research that they're wanting to do. And consequently, it keeps them from doing that really great, exciting, innovative, and advancing knowledge work. But research data management services, it really helps streamline the compliance, the storing, the sharing, the reporting, all of those pieces that that just are really important for when you're managing data. And if you have a service, then investigators spend less time on the paperwork and more time on the discovery. So we end up really reducing the administrative burdens. This service ultimately will really increase efficiency, enhance data quality, and strengthen the competitiveness of your grant proposal. That's why you want this. And so then you have these pieces of evidence that you can pull out, the amount of hours that are spent on it, and then just the impacts and the increased competitiveness when you have a really good data service. All right, so next slide. So we're going to spend just a little bit of time where we know that your goals may vary depending on your institution, and like your Carnegie's research status, all of those things are going to come into play. So kind of think about that. So whether it's like developing a policy like Ellie touched on earlier, or your library may have a strategic plan that includes data management, just think through some of those things. And then you're going to select that goal, state that goal related to research data at your institution, and then make a list of stakeholders. And it could be specific people at your institution, or it could be positions if you're not quite sure, or maybe there's new positions getting stood up at your institution like we have here. And you're going to start to do some brainstorming in this activity. And so think about, who do you need to convince? Is it your IT department? Maybe we have a research computing unit within IT, and we want to identify who those people are that we want to have conversations with and really kind of give our elevator pitch to. Maybe it's research compliance. So our IT and our division of research have historically been in two different units. They work together a lot of times, but they've been under two different areas. Also think about your faculty senate, or if there's individual committees. So like our College of Arts and Sciences, they have an entire research committee that oversees and supports the research that happens. So go ahead and spend a little time, and we're going to use the chat just because of the size of the group that we have here. But if you want to add your goal to the chat or list of stakeholders, this is just a little bit of brainstorming that I've provided, but go ahead and share it out in your chat, and we're going to keep an eye on the time. And I'm going to ask Ellie and Yitzy to help me kind of keep an eye on the chat and maybe respond to comments that are made. But if you have a goal, or if there's particular groups in your area that you'd like. So I'll go ahead and stop talking for a few minutes and let you all do some brainstorming. I'm very curious if anyone has groups that they work with that are different from the ones that I just listed. Oh, absolutely. Data management plans for graduate students. That's excellent. And those graduate students often need support because they're really beginning their career.
We've had graduate students who weren't able to share their data after because they didn't realize that they needed informed consent. And it was in Mozambique.
Oh, curricular data services. Yeah. That's really great. Oh, Ellie is an excellent person to talk to about changing policies.
Just gonna say it is hard to change policies. I've been working on this for like 3 years.
Yeah. It takes a lot of tenacity.
Oh, I love this. Introduce data management best practices in upper level undergraduate and graduate courses. Oh, Ashley, it looks like we have some good sessions with that goal. Maybe you're doing one of them.
Yeah, Ellen, we started with an institutional repository and it basically people would contact us of, we've got to now write a data management plan, or what do I do with my data? It's a natural kind of progression out of the institutional repository world is what we found. Yeah, Julie, I think that's really good to get invited to do that. It took us a while, I think, to really be able to talk about and lean into our disciplinary expertise here. Because for me, it was new. We literally just like pick up the phone and can you tell us what metadata is? And, and we're just kind of responding to these random questions. But over time, what I remind people, yes, you can be sitting there talking to researchers and they are clearly experts in their field, but you are the only person sitting at the table with the high level expertise on data management. So you are the expert in that room when it comes to this area. So it's awesome when people start to see that. That's great. Are there any stakeholders that you're thinking of that we didn't talk about? Awesome.
When it comes to data literacy, other librarians can be your stakeholders too, because you need their buy-in to, get that program going.
Yeah, I've noticed that in some of these is that folks are identifying subject area specialist library, and I think that, yeah, sometimes you have to start from within.
I learned recently that's called inReach. I
Hmm.
didn't know that.
Repeatable workshops is a good one too.
That's really
We got
good.
some great stuff here, y'all.
Uh,
Well, I'm gonna take us to the next bit. We're gonna break this out just a little bit more. And so one of the things that we found has been very helpful is this kind of idea of mapping your stakeholders. And so one thing that we've kind of found is that we can split them into sort of two buckets, maybe with a pipe between them. And we break those into two different groups, kind of audience and champions. And so the first one is audience. So these are the people who will actually use the product or service. So some of the things that is helpful is to kind of ask, what do your audiences need that your service provides? And we found that the best way to do that is to just set up conversations with those audience folks and ask, what do you need? What would you need in order to use this, to do this? We found that, a very easy, example of an audience, member is faculty, or I guess, internal librarians, who are often motivated by tenure and promotion or research funding, and publishing, are also quite important to those folks. And so those, if you can frame it within that lens, it can be a great way to start a conversation. This is helpful for your T&P. This can help you get more research funding, or publish more, or you might be able to publish more easily, for helping you with DMSPs. But another group that we found, falls within this audience is managers, such as department heads and deans, who are often motivated more by the need to demonstrate project towards strategic goals or compliance with policies and regulations. And so different group, different mindset, but it's helpful to kind of think, how would you frame what your service is for someone who thinks more in that, critical thinking, compliance, benchmarky way. The next set of stakeholders that we've kind of identified are what we call champions. And so these are people who have influence to set policy, affect budgets, and make changes to infrastructure. So essentially folks with decisional authority. But there's also just those people that are excited about your work, that can kind of be evangelists for what you're doing. Maybe it's, that first person you did that service with that, just like can't stop talking about how much it helped them. And so it's really helpful to keep in mind with this, especially with champions and audiences, that it's not usually it's actually not the person all the way at the top that you need to convince. Usually it's, someone a couple rungs below that actually has more influence. We've found that sometimes the admin assistant is as important as the dean. We've also found that some people are both audience and champions. So, a faculty member who just can't stop talking about it. But also administrators can have a lot of decisional authority, which would make them, part of your audience, but they can also be executive sponsors. So they can be a champion in that sense. When identifying stakeholders in both groups, here's a couple tips. So never underestimate the power of committee work. The committees that you're in can a lot of times have some of that audience or even champions. The more involved you are in service work outside of the library, the more opportunities you'll have to identify stakeholder needs. It's, all of us really like to talk about what our needs are. And so, especially within committee, just, talking. And so it can be really helpful to be in those, rooms in order to hear about needs. We've also found that working outside of your goal can put you in proximity to audiences or champions that can actually help support your goal. For example, a lot of us, because of the way we work with information literacy, have found our ways into AI groups on campus. And so we have found that there are a lot of influencers, a lot of champions, and, kind of those managers, decisional authority folks that are in those groups. And that really helps us identify data needs and helps us identify stakeholders and champions that we can then utilize for our services. So what we want to do now is kind of return back to our list of stakeholders. And try to take a look at them, think about some of the pain points or needs that a stakeholder might have, state how your service could help them. And then if we have a little bit of time, you could also take a look at some of those folks that you've identified maybe as an audience or just any of those stakeholders. Could they be both audience or champions, or are they one or the other? So let's throw in the chat kind of what what pain points those stakeholders might have, how your service might actually meet that need or that pain point, and then are any of your stakeholders, what are your stakeholders, more audience or champions or both?
Ellie, do you want to expand on that? Is part of the issue that just version control? Is that a version control issue, or that the data is stored on the equipment?
Yeah, so if you have data stored on aging equipment, you might only be able to export it in formats that are no longer super easy to work with. or might require conversion.
We're also dealing with some pain issues with people leaving the institution, and how do you manage that if data is on like a shared server, or we have some kind of vested interest in a project. And I think there's also issues with like the relationships between the PI or the researcher and then their graduate students who may want to leave, the institution and go to a different institution to continue on their line of research.
Rachel, this is true. Alignment with the strategic goals is both important to point out and important. Because why are you doing it otherwise, And I think a lot of librarians are hesitant with data-related topics, Nikki. I agree. Yeah, Ellie, that's right. The software and the hardware go hand in hand.
Pagan, that's a really good one about the awareness and navigation to data services across multiple units. I think one thing Ellie did that I thought was really great was they just literally mapped out every unit, every, department, every what was it? Like things like the Intermountain Bird Observatory, like things where they're
Labs.
like labs, like, and just created this really wonderful, huge bird's eye view of just like what is everything and where is it? And it's rare to actually find that accessibly.
Got a couple of people pointing out like that sometimes services for around data are decentralized. It could be difficult to identify and navigate them. And that's like across a lot of areas. It could be just lab space or, something where you're not necessarily interacting with the division of research.
I feel like some of that is amplified because this is sort of a newer area of service around data management, like the federal funders requiring those data management plans, I think have provoked some of this conversation. And so there isn't, like what we find on our institution is there hasn't been policy that has helped direct people to this work. So that's why Ellie has taken years to work on building that consensus across campus.
Oh, Allie, that's a really good point. And sometimes researchers have like terabytes and terabytes of data, especially in the climate sciences. Okay, looks like we're slowing down a little. Let's move on to the next section. So now that you've identified your stakeholders and aligned your goals to their needs, you can start to develop reusable content that you can then customize to your audience and also create easy tools so that your audience can engage with you. So first thing are these one-pagers. Nobody's going to read a 10-page paper about data management, but you can create one-pagers that might be text and visuals or infographics that bring to life a topic in an easy to digest format. So as you begin to talk to your stakeholders, you may find that you start to identify some of those champions, and these are great. One-pagers are a great thing to be able to hand to them that they can then share out. Makes it really easy for them to share about your services. So, for instance, if a faculty member uses the RIMS to find a collaborator and then gets a grant, that's a great one-pager. So, and these one-pagers don't have to be about something super onerous, or, I have one on just open data storage formats or data storage formats for archival purposes. So, you're the expert in research data. They are the expert in their discipline. You could also create case studies, and these don't have to be big and complex. They could be kind of narrative or storytelling in tone, almost like a press release, that it could highlight the impact of your work on one researcher or one research group, or maybe a similar resource at another institution. We like to use slide decks that we can easily modify and reuse for different audiences. And it's helped our unit provide consistent messaging as each of us meets with units around the experts portal, the RIMS. So in addition to these types of media pieces, you could create tools to allow for engagement. This is a no-brainer, but I really think it's a good idea to create an email address for the service or product so that people remember how to reach you. And also, of course, it helps out for vacations and sick time and stuff. And then another thing we do is we use an intake form to collect information prior to meeting with our researchers for a data management consultation. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. But first, next slide. This is an example of a tip sheet, a one-pager. And as you can see, this one's about data management planning. And Yitzy's going to put in the chat a link to a collection of these that we've created here. And then at the bottom, you know, it gives them individuals information about how they can engage with us. So it's like a twofer. You get information about data management planning, and it's a business card, a calling card. So these could be really handy when you're just interacting with people on campus and you get a question about a particular topic. In fact, you know, this is often how I come up with topics for creating new tip sheets, but it's easy to just send a copy to them. For instance, we get a lot of questions about metadata, and so we have a tip sheet on metadata and so forth. So also consider where you might integrate these or where you might add links to these explainer items. So if you have a grant management system at your institution, we use InfoEd here, or like the DMP tool or another data management planning tool, you can usually add links to those tools. Next slide. Okay, so this, I mentioned we use an intake form. When a researcher needs a consultation with us, we use the intake form to collect information about their proposal project, what funding solicitation they're using, I should say, where they're applying NSF, maybe it's a chemistry directorate. And then we prepare before we sit down with the researcher for 30 to 60 minutes, ask them questions, and then we draft a plan. So this is the Kanban view at the back end showing part of our workflow. So when a researcher sends in that intake form, it creates a record, and then we can move that record from one place to the next to show where our consultation and planning process is in that workflow. And so after survey sent, we close it out. Let's see. And it's nice because we don't forget steps. It's really easy to forget steps along the way. So next slide. So here's another activity. If you go back to your list, maybe flesh out your list of pain points a little bit. And then think about what advocacy tools you might develop to help sell your service or tell your story. And as with the other activities, you could share your ideas in the chat when you're ready. I should say I also find these tip sheets handy for librarians because they're very, they could use them if they get a question, and it helps them understand what we do in our unit because we're kind of a specialized unit.
I really like the metadata tip sheet because that tends to be a very popular. What is metadata?
Yeah,
I can
that
do
link that
that.
Yitzy put in the chat, Dixon, has a link to the metadata tip sheet. I'll go find it for you.
Yeah, I'm digging.
Okay.
The formats one is a big one too. I'll link that one too.
Megan, I love the idea of having sort of a outline of a webinar so that people could take notes easily, like they have kind of the basics and can add in their own comments, notes. I like the idea of the tip sheets for accessible data and documentation files, especially with the new federal regulations around accessibility at universities. And yeah, please share links to your things you've developed. I see a lot of people are interested in the webinar series.
I like that case study.
I could see doing a, Megan mentioned a fair data tip sheet. I could see even doing an overview one and then one for each element. Oh, I see that was webinars, but anyway, I could see tip sheets for fair.
I like the idea of case studies as well. And I just want to add, if you create these kinds of materials, think about adding them to a repository or just really value those as a form of your research output, as part of your like body of work that you've done. That's one thing that I think we've had to kind of wrestle with within our institution of that we use the Boyer's model of scholarship here at Boise State as part of how we articulate our facultiness. And so I just really want to encourage people to just recognize that this is part of your expertise that you're communicating out. So and it makes it easier for others to find it and build upon what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, they can have a big impact on the profession.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know that we've talked about how we could identify case studies for our RIMS. You know, can we start? Are we at a mature enough point where we can start identifying faculty members that are connecting with, you know, faculty members they hadn't before? Are they generating more research? Are they finding, you know, new equipment that they didn't know they had access to? Those types of things, and that's been a really interesting conversation to have.
I feel like this work that we're doing in our unit kind of keeps building upon itself. So I like this earlier conversation about like, how do you bring in other librarians into the discussion? Because as we keep building our knowledge in this area, it allows us to work in other areas. I think this is part of what's helped us launch our RIMS and get to a place where we're starting to really develop reports, not only for ourselves, but other units on campus. And the easy sort of area to work in is research outputs. So all that scholarly communication, all those articles and theses and dissertations, no one else on campus is working with that data and working with that information in the way that the library is. And so it's almost a snowball rolling downhill, which I think has been good for us as far as our building our relationships across campus.
Rachel mentions data citation and how to report data sets as research products. And for some of our faculty who are new to data sharing, maybe they're social science and do human subjects type work, it can be kind of a carrot, right? Like Yes, but you can get a DOI and you can be cited for that data. I agree, Allie. They should be in researcher profiles like ORCID. All right, looks like we're starting to slow down. I'll pass the baton to Michelle.
All right. So the last topic that we wanted to talk about this morning is the metrics and the impact evidence that you can start to build around the work that you're doing. And once again, we sort of put it into two categories for the sake of this presentation. One is demonstrating the needs. So actually thinking about what does your particular institution need? And then you can do that. And then the other is the impact and progress of the work as you keep standing up these services. So when you think about demonstrating that your service is needed, what numbers can show that there's a problem or that there is an unmet need on your campus? This might be like benchmarking metrics with other institutions. We do a lot of work around our peer institutions and our aspirational institutions here. And then the other is you have to make sure that you're demonstrating that your service is having an impact and that you've made progress. It's absolutely critical that you do that. Otherwise, why are you spending this time and effort? So is your service being used? Is it saving your researchers time and money? And is your institution helping, or is your service helping your institution meet its goals? So really, we've had it very clearly articulated on our campus. If you're doing something that is not moving your institution's strategic plan forward, then you should not be doing that work. That's just the reality that we work in. So some places that you can look to locate data that you can help with this, with these metrics is you might talk to your Office of Institutional Research. Here it's called the Office of Institutional Effectiveness. This is where you can usually find your peer institutions. We also like to look at the IPEDS data. It gives you information about higher education institutions. So, and it also includes things like student body demographics, tuitions, graduation rates, staffing data, that sort of thing. And it's really good for comparing institutions. So it might be within your state, it might be within your region, or once again, those peer institutions that have been specifically identified. The other area that we've found value in is the Higher Education Research and Development Survey. It's also called Hertz survey, and it can help you with things like the research enterprise at your campus, and it will have things like expenditures, the sources of funding, research fields. And then related to this, we also are getting value out of SciVal and Scopus and Web of Science. And those are different tools that we've licensed here. So those are areas that I would look at to find some of that data. If there are other sources of data that you found useful, I would just really encourage you to add that to the chat. And so next slide, let's see. The last thing we wanted to do is that we really want to emphasize that as data librarians, we are uniquely positioned to make a real impact on research data practices at our institution. Like I said, just really lean into the fact that this is disciplinary expertise that you have and you are continuing to build. You are the expert sitting in the room whenever you're doing this work. So take a few minutes to look over your notes and then really reflect on your plans for this advocacy toolkit that we hope we've been able to help you build. Think about what your next steps are and what questions you have. And then here's the last thing we wanted to offer to you is just please reach out to us. We've got our email address here. We just reach out and set up a meeting with us. We would be very interested to talk to you and learn about your institution, what you're planning, and just really kind of have a dialogue with you. So that's our last offer, and we hope that this has been helpful. And so just, yeah, let's talk.
We have a few minutes for questions if you have any, or we could pass it off to Peace and Heather. All right. Well, I'm excited to see this half of the presentation. Thank you all.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. All right, well, there are, as you know, two parts to this session. We've covered areas of influence and impact from the data librarian perspective. So in the second half, we'll provide areas of impact from the perspective of financial decision makers. So welcome to part two. I'm Peace, the Director of Research Data Services at MIT. This is a position which began a year ago. However, I've had experiences at other institutions as well. Currently, I'm running the Data and Specialized Services Department, which has programs for data management services, GIS and statistical services, and citation management and writing tools. I am joined by Heather Sardis, who I report to, and she is the library's one of the associate directors of the library. She's the associate director for technology and strategic planning, and she runs the directorate for digital library services. Placement within this directorate for us within RDS, or DSS is what we call it at MIT, is new and is allowing for a more structural focus on data services, which will allow us to develop strategically. Next slide. So as you've heard from Boise State colleagues here, advocacy is really important, and thinking about how you can work with the resources, the human resources that you have, are incredibly important. In this part of the session, we'll give you the basics to help you think about how you can impact your data program through your resources. There are three elements that comprise data resources, which are first, the financial assets spent to maintain the program. Second, there are the tools and technology that are paid for in the form of systems and infrastructure. So you heard a lot of references to their RIMs. There's also things like memberships through things like in subscriptions like DMP tool, your data repositories, and so on. Your actual hardware and software maybe that you're providing to your community, and then services that may be outsourced through paying for external provisions of things like data curation and statistical services. Lastly, there's a more frequently discussed category, which is time and expertise, which refers to the data team itself. And today we will focus on financial assets. Although it will look different for each institution, we'll share what we wish we'd known earlier about how money works in higher education and how this impacts our services.
Hi.
All right, so I'm going to pass it on to Heather.
Hey everyone, I'm Heather Sardis. Like Peace said, I'm the Associate Director for Technology and Strategic Planning at the MIT Libraries. And before I go through this slide, I'll just note that I am probably unusual among this group in that I am not a data librarian and I'm not a data subject matter expert. I am an administrator, and a part of the reason that Peace and I really wanted to do this presentation together was we can kind of give these two perspectives on how to sustain a data program. And so what I'm here to share is what sustainability, financial sustainability looks like from the administrative perspective. And so with that in mind, what we'll cover today are first, an intro to finance strategy. So we'll talk about what that means. What does it mean to have a financial strategy? Ellie and the Boise State team covered so many fantastic details about building a program strategy and services. And Peace and I are going to focus on what does that surrounding financial model look like to sustain those programs and those services. Then we'll get into just a brief overview of higher ed funding sources. So what types of money come into higher education institutions, and then how is that money dispersed out to the programs that you all manage? And how can you use that information to build a sustainable financial strategy? And what sorts of things might you look out for? And then we'll close with a focus on strategic decision making. So once you have that understanding of your financial landscape, how do you use that to prioritize within your program? How do you use that to make good decisions about what to invest in and what to pull back in, especially in times of financial insecurity? So we can go on to the next slide. Before we get into any of that, though, we will start with an audience question. So we'd love to hear from all of you. Tell us a little bit about what your current role is. And we're thinking from the perspective of like, what is your relationship to financial decision making? Is it one, something that you're interested in, but you're not currently working on? Two, is it 50% or more of your role is focused on data services? Three, you're in a financial decision-making position. That might mean you have a modest budget. That might mean you're making decisions at a higher level about what goes across your program. Or four, are you in an administrative position, like an associate director, a director, an AUL? Just to get a sense of where we all sit. Okay, not surprising, lots of folks who are focused on data services. I'm imagining probably lots of data librarians. Somebody at 1.5, I like that, splitting the difference. Cool. Okay, then I think that gives us kind of a good quick snapshot of where folks are sitting in their organizations. And hopefully, the information that we're going to share gives you a little bit of insight into what happens before money hits your data programs and how you can use that information to strategically advocate, strategically grow your program. So let's go to the next slide. With all of that in mind, then I'm going to take a little bit of time to just talk about funding sources in higher ed. What does the broader funding landscape look like, and how you can understand the funding sources that come into your institution, because it looks a little bit different from institution to institution, and how that can be the foundation of building an effective and, most importantly, a sustainable funding strategy for your data teams. That's something that's going to look different from team to team and institution to institution, but we'll take a look at what some of those differences are and what that might mean for you and your teams. So let's go on to the next slide. And so something that was a driving inspiration for this presentation for both Peace and I are, what did we wish that we knew about finance in higher ed? We're in decision-making roles now, and we can also remember when we were in librarian roles and when we were in roles inside of data teams, and there were things that were a mystery to us. So we're hoping by spending a little bit of time sharing that knowledge, it will be useful and save you some heartbreak along the way. So next slide, please. So the first thing that we'll talk about are just what types of money makes up the revenue of an institution. I think whether we're in a nonprofit, a higher ed institution, in industry, every institution typically has revenue, which is the money that is coming in, and then spending, which is where that money goes once it is in. We simplified this a little bit, but we'll look at the 5 kind of major revenue sources for higher ed. So these are the most typical types of revenue sources that you're going to see. Obviously, everybody is very familiar with sponsored research, and that could take the form of grants to sponsor research. That could take the form of corporate sponsorships. That might be funding specific types of innovation or development, but it's an outside entity that is providing funding to sponsor the work that is happening in a higher ed institution. The second type of revenue that we'll look at is donations, also probably very familiar. That is seeking, it could be gifts that are tied to a specific program. It could be gifts that specifically endow a program, but it could also be unrestricted gifts. Like maybe there's a donor that just feels passionate about the library, and so they give a gift without any rules about how that can be spent. The third type of revenue is government allocations. Those might be coming from the county government, state level, or federal level. And they vary wildly from institution type to institution type, and certainly are in the news quite a bit lately. The fourth revenue source tends to be tuition and learner fees. So especially in North American institutions that charge tuition, that can be a significant portion of the revenue, or it could be a smaller portion, depending on what the other revenue sources look like. But when we say tuition and learner fees, we're counting not just the tuition that students pay to attend the school, but also earnings from continuing education or professional programs, room and board costs, and even things like library fees, which we're probably all quite familiar with. And then finally, our last category is just other. And that's a catch-all for things like investment and real estate, which can actually be a pretty significant part of an institution's revenue profile. A lot of higher ed institutions function as landlords. They may own significant land, buildings, other properties in an area, and that makes up a pretty significant portion of the revenue. But it could also include things like parking fees or admission to museums on campus. And for medical campuses, that could include fees for patient care. So typically, sorry, I'm getting over COVID. Let me just take a second. Typically, when you look at the revenue breakdown for an institution of higher ed, you're going to see these 5 different revenue sources making up a pretty significant portion of the income that's coming in. So we can move on to the next slide from here. And as an illustration of how these different funding sources make up the revenue of an institution, we'll look at our own as a case study. So both Peace and I are at MIT, which is a private institution, and it relies heavily on sponsored research for about half of its revenue. So that 47% that you see on the right side of this pie chart. At MIT, that breaks down into around 14% for campus-based sponsored research. So that's faculty grants, research grants, etc., and about 30% for sponsored research within the Lincoln Laboratory, which is kind of a separate entity within MIT that focuses on defense and other applications. So that's actually a pretty significant portion of that 47% that you see. And so what that means for MIT is that cultivating research sponsorship is a really important part of MIT's overall revenue strategy to ensure that revenue stays stable. And now we'll look at the other half of the funding. That other half of funding is very highly impacted by the economy. When the economy is weaker or less stable, this half of funding tends to fluctuate because returns on investments, returns on real estate are going to be strongly affected in a weaker economy. It might also affect donors' willingness to make donations. And so economic fluctuations might require an institution with this type of funding profile to have to make cuts, or as in previous institutions that I've worked at, draw from the endowment at a higher rate and just generally rethink how money is dispersed within the institution once it's in. I think let's go on to the next slide. On the next slide, we zoom out just a little bit to compare what revenue profiles look like at different types of institutions. So the private university column, that maps to the pie chart that we just showed you from MIT. So you'll see 50% of revenue is coming from sponsored research, 30% is coming from the donations and endowment, and then a smaller portion is coming from other sources. You'll see that some of these percentages are highlighted in green. Those represent anything that's over 15% of that institution's revenue. So changes to those buckets will have a proportionately higher effect on the amount of money that's available in an institution. So you'll see MIT is very affected by changes to sponsored research, and slightly less affected by changes to donations or investment returns. In the center column, you'll see a profile for a private university that has a health system. So a pretty significant part of revenue is coming from patient care costs. That's 22%. And a relatively less percent, but still impactful, is coming from sponsored research. And then it's a little bit more distributed profile across donations, other earnings, government support, tuition, and learner fees. So you can think about how those two different institutions would be affected differently by changes to the economy, changes to the population that relies on a particular institution for healthcare, and so on. And then finally, we've included a profile for a large public university. So you'll see that a large public university is going to be very dependent on tuition and learner fees. That forms, it's actually the only of these profiles where tuition and learner fees make up more than 15% of the revenue of the institution. And a pretty balanced dependence on government funding, obviously, as a public university, and sponsored research, with a little bit less on donations, endowment, and other earnings. So you can imagine that an institution with that type of profile is really susceptible if there are major changes at the federal level, or if there are changes to sponsored research, and so on. So each institution is going to feel an uncertain economy in different ways. And it's going to, for those of you, those of us that are working in programs within each institution, knowing what the profile of your institution looks like can serve almost as like a crystal ball to help you see what changes might be coming down the road and give you really useful information about how you might make your own programs more resilient. Calling back to something from the Boise State team, in times like this, where we have fiscal uncertainty, it's critical that every single aspect of your program be tied to the strategic priorities of your institution, because you can see different impacts that might hit the institution may result in cuts and may result in changes to the way that the institute is dispersing that funding. And you can set your program up for resiliency and sustainability and success by making a really clear case for how the work that you're doing ties into the institutional priorities. I'm not going to go too far down that path because that forms what Peace is going to talk about next, but it's just an attempt to tie in what you're seeing in this chart to some of that programmatic and strategic decision making. So let's go on to the next slide. So now we'll take a look at once that revenue is in, so whether it's coming from government, whether it's coming from grants, whether it's coming from real estate investments, once it's in, how are institutions making decisions about dispersing or allocating that money to different schools, departments, and programs across the institution? These allocations are really critical to determining the sustainability of your program. How much money is flowing to the library, how much money is flowing to a research data center, and then how much of that is being allocated for specific services that are being provided by data teams. So before we get into that, we wanted to just take a moment and talk about some definitions, some terms that we'll be using. So once revenue is received, it's allocated through the institution's budgeting process, which is typically going to be an annual process. I'm sure that we're all at least clued into when that's happening or when we get the results. And those allocations determine how much hard money each unit is receiving. And we're defining hard money as ongoing base budget funding that's allocated through your institution's regular budget process and can be reasonably expected to continue year over year. Obviously, a budget cut year is a major exception to that, but in general, if your program is receiving hard money, that means that somewhere on a budget balance sheet is the funding for your program, and it's expected that that money will be provided year over year unless there is a cut. And then by contrast, some of that money might be given on a temporary or time-limited basis, and that's what's known as soft funding. That could take many different forms. It could be a grant that you have sought from your program. Like maybe you have applied for a grant and specifically funding student workers or some aspect of the service that you provide. It could be that your institution has said, here's $100,000 in a one-time basis to do a specific project that you need to do. Maybe it's upgrading computers, maybe it's upgrading a physical space, but that is money that is given on a one-time basis and is not expected to continue afterwards. And a really key part of running and sustaining a data program is knowing the money that's coming into your program. Is it hard money? Is it soft money? And where do you invest each type of money? Obviously, where you have hard money, you want to invest that into core services that are strongly aligned with your institution's priorities and that make up kind of the strategic basis of what you're trying to accomplish with your data program. And you might use soft money for periodic equipment upgrades or something experimental where you need to gather some more data in order to make the case for justifying the continued funding. But it starts with asking the right questions and knowing what type of money is coming in, looking at your balance sheet, talking to the folks that make those budget decisions, and understanding, is this grant money and you're going to have to scramble to find money to fill in that gap next year, or is it relatively assured to continue on a year-over-year basis? So let's move on to the next slide. So now we're going to put it all together. Basically, thinking about how revenue comes into your organization, so government, grants, real estate investments, etc., that gives you a little bit of insight into what changes you might expect, what fluctuations you might expect, and also in stronger economic times when there might be an opportunity to ask for more funding. You can typically get that type of revenue information from looking at your institution's financial report. I think all of our institutions, actually, I don't know if this is true, but I think they're obligated to put that out publicly. So you can typically Google it, look on your website, and just read what is your institution's revenue profile and where might there be risks, where might there be opportunities. And then thinking about how that money is then dispersed within the institution and to your data program. Putting that all together means, one, understanding your organization's revenue profile, knowing what it looks like so that you can anticipate external pressures from economic shifts, from shifting government priorities, from differing trends in tuition. And then understanding your own program's funding sources, so how money flows to your program once it's in your institution, that reveals where you have stability and where you might need to advocate or diversify the types of funding that are coming to your program, where you might need to augment with additional grants, where you might need to advocate with your leadership team for making your services a part of the library's year-over-year budget. And then finally, together, those insights enable you to build your strategic funding plan. So that might involve targeting external opportunities. It could involve cultivating donors, working with your institution's fundraising team to build donors that are specifically committed to your data program. And it might look like advocating internally to sustain and grow your program. And that's something Peace and I are working a lot on together right now. So let's go to the next slide where we have another audience question. Reflecting back on all of that information about revenue profiles and the way that funding is dispersed within an organization, do you know what your institution's revenue profile looks like? Do you have a sense of that? Is that something that, if you haven't thought about previously, can you Google and find it? Is it accessible to you? And then when you have that information, how does that shape your thinking about financial planning and your priorities for data services? Are there changes that you've made within your program based on changing funding sources? Are there things that you have looked into and then advocated for based on the type of funding that flows to your program? So take some time in the chat to share your thoughts. Oh, thank you, Lene. I'm getting caught up on the chats. And yeah, Peace, a lot of credit goes to Peace for Peace has said co-developing. I would say 90% developing. Peace is an amazing slide builder.
And I also comment on Rachel's suggestion to find a nerdy friend like her who can't wait to tell you about how fee expenditures are limited. I also love to tell the hit at parties that at my old institution, parking fees were how we paid for building development. So I used to be around the president a lot, and he would complain anytime, like it would just be a thing you knew never to share your parking pass with anyone, because he would bring it up randomly in meetings because we were trying so hard to build new like research buildings and things like that. So you never know how one thing leads to another, but that's what this presentation's all about, right?
Yeah, it's looking for those creative funding strategies, like surreptitiously planting a tree in front of a no parking sign to increase parking violation revenue. Okay, cool. So I think if folks do want to share any insights in the chat, please feel free to do so. And if this feels like new information to you, then I would encourage you, like take a moment to Google like your institution's financial report. And just having Googled a couple different ones in the course of working on this presentation, they typically include those same types of pie charts towards the front. So it's a really easy way to just get a line on how your institution is funded and what external pressures it might be susceptible or less susceptible to, and then think through how that might inform how you prioritize the services in your program. And on that note, it's the perfect segue over to Peace, who is going to talk a little bit more about strategic decision making and how you build that strategic case for your program.
Yeah, so if you've never seen that pie chart, if it's 3D, I shudder, but some folks in the comments have said that they've seen theirs. Maybe you remember or don't. Allie mentioned that they've seen theirs at their institution, and sponsored research is much smaller, but tuition is their most important revenue source. So I thought that was interesting. And that others who have a public health sciences university, Amy, um, they got the 1-2 punch of the budget crisis, which we'll talk about a little bit more later in one of our activities. Oh, somebody posted their pie chart. Thank you, Ellie, for showing that 52.5% is from tuition, learner fees, and so on. So yeah, getting an idea of that, it also makes a lot more sense when you hear how the library talks. I was at an institution that was transitioning to R1 and Tier 1. We talked a lot about learners, and it got to the point where we talked about teaching and research, almost like two separate but important things. Whereas at MIT is very research focused. Even the students do, quite a bit of research themselves. So we talk a lot about researchers. That's like the lingo in the library. So you'll see that reflected and kind of echoed across your institution. So thank you for those who are posting your proportions in the chat. I'll go ahead and continue on with the my own slides. So we've looked at what impacts the library's budget and how various accounts are used for state-sustaining libraries research data services. So now we'll get into the how. How do you make strategic decisions with your research data services funds based on these factors in order to keep the mission and vision of the libraries and the larger organization in mind? It's important to think outside of your own department as well, because data is typically a newer or rapidly developing service in the library environment. So because of this, we often have to make the case for why research resources should be allocated or diverted to data rather than having it be a standing assumption or the status quo, as is with many more traditional library services. In libraries with more established data services, their financial status may look like what is displayed here, where different resources are covered by different financial accounts within and outside of the department. So the center column here represents whether you have a department, a person, however data services are being provided. That's kind of the domain of control in the center here. And then the two on the outside are maybe within or outside of your control in, it's a scale going from full control to somewhat control to no control whatsoever. So on the left, you can see that memberships and data repositories are typically paid by budgets within the library, but external to the RDS department. Of course, it could be different where you are, but it could come from the general budget. It could come from the collections budget. As RDS becomes more developed, you'll either have to collaborate or adjust your management and authority over data technology and systems in order to kind of sustain and create some consistency within your own realm of control. In addition, there may be library or institutional initiatives, as well as carry forward funds, which we talked about in the chat, which are unspent and unallocated money, typically later in the fiscal year, where we need to figure out something to do with this money. And those are good opportunities for helping you show proof of concept or transition the RDS department to having authority for something that may have originated elsewhere in the library. Supplemental funding can also come from this place over time and become an allocation in the future to the RDS department annually. So that's really a way to grow your department, is to kind of show the value through something temporary like a grant, carry forward funds, or other avenues. And then when that value is seen, there may be changes to how the library's funding is allocated. Next slide. So you'll want to keep aware of kind of three components of navigating the pressures on the data program funding. And I will mention this presentation is definitely a reflection of what's happening nationally right now. So you'll see that in our examples as a way to practice kind of what we're talking about. So first is our external pressures. These are things that are completely outside of your control, right? These are things like the economy, funding from the government, and even just the overall institution's financial health. But you will want to keep a thumb on what is happening and what's going on. How are things changing? Enrollment numbers, governmental priorities, and how can you be of assistance or be part of where those priorities are shifting? Internal value talks about your own library or your own institution, and what is the value for your data services? Are you seen? Are you visible? Do you have other competing priorities within the library that may be also growing that you might have to figure out, okay, these are important too, or we would like to collaborate with them or otherwise show value so that you are still kind of maintaining the program over time and maybe not seeing a shrinking of funding for your projects? And then also think of places for effective advocacy in order to maintain or grow the benefit of what you're providing by communicating your program's impact and ROI, which the Boise State colleagues before us did a great job of talking all about how to do that. Lastly, I'll focus on departmental decisions, which are things within your realm of control. So how can you find new opportunities for funding, and then also manage the assets that you have access to, whether they be accounts that are specifically for your data program, to keep in mind shifting changes externally to you in order to sustain your program. Also think about the opportunities as well. So can you, if you are a institution that does have a very strong donor relationship, how can you tap into that philanthropic network and make clear ways that donors can get excited and energetic about data services and grow your services that you're providing? You can also seek funding outside of libraries, so things about data science, public health, digital humanities. Also, researchers themselves. At my last institution, we funded a lot of the technology in our data lab through partnerships on grants, where the income we were making from the grants were set aside in a account, or also called a call center, for technological innovation in our lab. Next slide. So during times of hardship, you want to be proactive and strategic with the financial management so you can protect your program from the most severe impacts. Of course, the goal is to spend smartly to guard against anticipated hits. Now, how to do that? I have 5 key strategies for you for financial hardship times like these that I'm going to talk about next. So first, you want to develop tiered service models. Well, what is that? That is, think about your data services programs in terms of what can be shed or increased upon based on the opportunities that come or cuts that might happen. So you can know what to cut first or what to grow first if the budget is grown or reduced by 5%, 10%, and so on. And what services or resources would you invest in or pause or retire? Having a plan demonstrates foresight and control and can really help in times of uncertainty, because you've had time to think through it versus just react to what's going on. You'll want to prioritize long-term value. So focus spending on investments that will prevent future costs or service degradation. So for example, investing in people tends to allow for service continuity, investing in structure of the services and institutional knowledge and awareness, and of course, preventing loss of personnel. You can also make purchases for accounts for specific purposes so that spending does not have to be requested each year. And then that kind of goes back to what I talked about in an earlier slide about how there might be accounts that are outside of your control. How much more can you pull and advocate to your leadership around having accounts that are within your control, because you may have different priorities. So I mentioned data repositories, right, that may not be purchased through the library, through the data services program. Well, if it's not a priority for collections, they may be looking to cut it. And it may be something that you, as a data services lead, may decide, well, there's something else I'd rather cut. Or, yes, that is what we want to cut, but for different reasons. So then the priorities make sense for your department rather than external to you. When you are able to do that, then you can document and justify these actions and these accounts. So when you do set up accounts that are for specific purposes, as one example, we have an account within my library for our data lab, and it's for maintaining the hardware in that lab. And it's helpful because then it has a purpose. It's much harder to shift and change because it's not part of like just a larger general budget. When you have these accounts, you can document their purposes. And even if those accounts exist outside of your department, even they might be in the collections department, you can create a document that specifies who makes decisions about the spending out of that account and how decisions are made, so that then those data services priorities can be included. During times of hardships, if you are trying to spend maybe differently than you typically do, don't frame your decisions as spending the money before we lose it, even though I do that. But use strategic investments to ensure continuity of service and mitigate future risk. Language obviously is important. And then anticipate and act. These are kind of the last of the four active during hardship steps. So if you do foresee freezes or fund sweeps, maybe you're anticipating that by the wonderful slides that Heather introduced of where your funding is coming from, and a huge news piece that source is getting cut drastically. Maybe you can start anticipating cuts and start making strategic spending right away to identify legitimate mission critical ways to spend down those funds, and think about prepaying maybe for multi-year software licenses. You could stock up on supplies or invest in hardware that maybe you won't have in your budget for next year or future years. And the last step is more like do this all the time, which is continuously advocate. The more integral you are to your institution's mission, of course, the harder you are to cut. I was going to talk more about that, but I think our folks with Boise State did a wonderful job at talking about how to advocate. Don't ever stop, no matter what position you're in. Keep doing that, and that will be very helpful, particularly where they talked about with audience versus champion. There's also kind of like what I usually use the phrase stakeholder, which is people you need to convince in order to do the thing. So, and that have an active stake in what you're doing. So you may need to communicate with them more frequently, and make sure you're using data points or examples that speak to what they're interested in. So is that the library's mission, if it's your library leadership? Is it heavy research areas that are showing growth within your institution? If you're talking to institutional leadership, make sure you're framing your messages in a way that's useful. Next slide. All right, so here's an example of one of the steps, which is develop service tiers. And this is just kind of me throwing out ideas there, where you have maybe tier 1 are your librarians and specialists, providing really in-depth expertise. They can meet with people, provide consultations, they can review data management plans, and so on. They can teach classes. But maybe your tier two are temporary employees. You can also hire student employees as a way to, again, show proof of concept, right? You hire these people, they're not permanent. And then that way, when they, a student employee, when they graduate, it's not a line item that you then have to figure out how to justify again. In my experience, I've hired graduate students for my data services who were phenomenal, by the way. And we actually ended up growing in the number from 1 to 4 graduate students providing data services. And that's a really flexible way to grow your services without, potentially having problems in the future during times of budget cuts. A third tier are your kind of online resources that are scalable, utilized by anyone who can have, who wants to access them. Our Boise State colleagues mentioned their tip sheets that they created, which are fantastic. There are also online tutorials. I mentioned DMP Tool again. I don't know, DMP Tool was just on my mind when I was making these slides, apparently. And then there's also like grant-based work where it's obviously, again, time-bound, temporary, not continuous funding that can grow or sustain a part of your services. Maybe you're building some infrastructure there that can be relied upon for long term. All right, so I just talked to you for a while, so I'd love to hear from you. Or have you done one or any of these where you have developed service tiers, or you've found through, anticipated cuts or even growth, and you kind of anticipated it and took an action that maybe not wasn't your consistent everyday spending? I'd love to hear from you what you've done, so I will take it to the chat. Has anyone made purchases in advance of tariffs? That's a good example of, trying to stretch your funding before, big changes come up. Yeah, so we've got a couple examples in the chat. Lenny mentioned service tiers, hiring students. So I'm happy to hear this has worked for others as well. Um, Salary is a big time thing, and student workers are also looking for the experience as well. It's very helpful for them to have it while they're in grad school. Of course, you want to pay them a salary that's competitive for students, but of course, it won't compare to hiring a full-time person. Yeah, and also the RIMS system at Boise State was something that was pushed for by the data librarians. Awesome. It's great to hear. Mm. Annual evaluations are a great time to think about advocacy. I think about it all the time, but that's a great time to think about it is, communicating a message. Back when I used to teach a lot of sessions as a librarian, I would always throw in something helpful to the professor, even though I was teaching to their students. I wouldn't say that. I would just include it, and then very often afterward, the professor would come up to me and say, "That thing you mentioned about blah blah blah, that was so helpful. I didn't even know about that," and they're like really excited about it, and that was a really great way to build relationships and become a trusted person when they want to come to you with new opportunities. Yeah, building a partnership with IT is extremely important. I'm sure Heather has a lot to say about that as kind of the head of that within our library and also research in computer sciences. Yeah. Oh, I love that, Nina, about prioritizing federal analysis time. Which funders your institution is most funded by. We didn't cover that, but that is huge, particularly right now as different things are happening with different funders. Yes, the new FAIR model, looking at F&A or indirect costs recovery. You all are doing a great job at anticipating my last activity. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on. Feel free to keep chatting. We'll go ahead to the next slide. All right, so I mentioned a few actions to take during a downturn, like prepaying for multiple years or even trying to get a perpetual access to valuable data sets so that, in future years, you have a little bit of breathing room in terms of a lower budget, investing in your staff, sending them for critical trainings or certifications that enhance your program's capabilities, fund travel to those key conferences now while you're able to do that if you feel that potential professional development budget cuts might come later. Invest in technology, so make purchases to prevent accounts from having any remaining money as you turn over a fiscal year, especially if your institution is having very imminent budget cuts. Oftentimes, they will sweep accounts that have money remaining or have conversations with the finance office, your central finance office, about why that money is there, if it's being saved up for a purchase, so that there's not a misunderstanding about what that is, and you can advocate for keeping those funds. And then also hire temporary staff, contractors, or student workers to complete a backlog project, such as curriculum development, like online tutorials that you could develop and be able to share out with a more reduced staff, or migrating a service, like we talked about in the chat about their RIMS service, and using one-time funds to achieve specific goals without adding permanent salary lines. Again, these can be flipped the other way too if more opportunities are coming your way for your library. How can you grow, thinking about these 5 key steps? Next slide. Okay, so we've learned kind of how, in general, to work when budget uncertainty is upon us. So we wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of practice talking about what to do. So I put up the examples that Heather covered earlier of a private university with a health system, a public university, but you could also think about your own institution, and if there were an impactful external occurrence, what steps would you take to sustain your program? So some current examples of occurring or potential external financial impacts include an endowment tax, a sudden halt to NIH funding, reduction in indirect costs. Ellie mentioned that FAIR proposal, cuts to Medicaid and Medicare if you are at a university that has a healthcare system, or just generally a recession. So I'd love to hear thoughts that you have about what could you do to anticipate these things and maybe take some action now to sustain your program. Okay, so Ellie, thank you for sharing that you talked about spinning up a data management certificate that could generate revenue. And I pulled up your institution's pie chart, which showed that tuition and fees was over 52%. Obviously, I didn't mention this, but also the infrastructure tends to match the funding as well. So a high learner focused school will typically have really great technology and support around developing education through, like in my last institution, Center for Distance Education. We taught a lot of online programs. They had, a studio and instructional designers and all of that. So it may be even easier to lean into the strengths of your institution, like creating a certificate at a place that is, really strong at teaching. Yeah, donor possibilities are also great. Right now, people are really focused on what's happening in higher education, and they're looking for what they can do. How can they help? So, reaching out to people who have strong relationships, either with your data services, the researchers who make the most use of your data services, or just library donors in general, can be helpful for finding new avenues for maintaining or supplementing funding. Rachel states that in their state, oops, it's moving, a general economic downturn would have a large effect on enrollment and tuition fees. That's true. Actually, we tend to see tuition generally in higher education. Tuition actually tends to grow during poor economies because people tend to unfortunately lose their jobs or, for one reason or another need to go back to school. So that may depend, vary depending on your institution. Um, so how could a change in the economy impact your library? Cost sharing is a great solution though. It's definitely something too that also builds buy-in, because when other offices are literally investing in those services, then they have a much greater stake in it and want to see it succeed. Partnering with community organizations is great. Thank you, Lenny. Interesting. Yeah. Thank you, Yitzy, for sharing about the library as a service center and thinking it kind of I feel like it puts more awareness to how the funds are flowing and where the library is valuing. I always say, look at where the money is going. That's what we value, right? If the money is growing in one area, that's showing investment in that thing. So thank you all. We can go to the next slide, for your thoughts and ideas and participating in this. We hope that the kind of multi-tiered presentation we had today had a place for you to grasp on and be able to make a difference at your institution. And we're happy to take any questions that might be remaining. I think we're at time though. I guess that's up to the facilitators.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Thank you to our presenters and our attendees for your participation in the chat and the notes document. There's been a lot going on, so I really appreciate it. We are going to leave the Zoom room open during the break. We are going to take a break from now until noon, but you can continue the conversation if you want in this room, or we will see you back at noon. So thank you all again.